What is free verse? How would you feel about it if I were to tell you that free verse, as most people understand that term, actually doesn't exist at all? Of course, how you feel about it is irrelevant. Unless, that is, you're a free verse poet writing poems about your feelings. The fact of the matter is that most of what passes for free verse today is actually just formless verse. It's dull, lopsided prose. But real free verse, true free verse, actually isn't like that at all. In this video, I'll be drawing from a textbook on versecraft, learning the secrets of English verse, keys to the treasure chest, co-authored by David J. Rothman and Susan Spear, who I will be interviewing in the second part of this episode. This video is essentially a summary of their chapter on free verse. As they say in their book, free verse is a form of verse, not a form of freedom. As is the case in formal verse, there is some kind of recurring pattern or expectation being set up for the reader. There may not be meter or rhyme, but there might be a specific syllable count or something else. There's a subtle structure. There has to be, because without structure, without patterns, there's no foundation to stand on. Art doesn't exist. So, what are some of these patterns? To examine this, we're going to dive into the history of free verse. It's something that actually goes back before Walt Whitman, though Whitman gets credited as the first free verse poet, and he was in the modern sense of that term as we understand it. As we'll see, Whitman has his own literary forebears. The first pattern we note is anaphora, or parallelism. This is the literary device where you reiterate your syntax, or in layman's terms, you repeat words. This is a very old technique. If we look at the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis in the King James translation, we notice that every verse after the first two begins with, "And God. And God said, Let there be light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God called the light day," etc. The Hebrew Bible would come to have an enormous influence on versifiers of all kinds, from the ancient to the modern. More on that later. The second type of pattern we come across in free verse poetry is syllabics. This concept was articulated by Elizabeth Dariush, and this is where instead of counting your lines in terms of stressed feet, you establish a strict syllable number for each line. It might be the same across all lines, or it might vary, as in the case of Marianne Moore's poem, The Fish. It establishes a pattern of 1, 3, 9, 6, and 8 syllables for each line in her stanzas. Number 3. Loose iambics. This is when, instead of writing in a strict iambic meter, where each pair of feet has an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, you might throw in a few extra syllables here and there, or cut them out. Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken is a case in point. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Notice that just in these first 3 lines, there's an extra syllable in each. Now, Frost was writing tightly controlled metrical poetry, but you can see how, if you loosen up your lines a bit more to the point where it doesn't quite scan, you encounter what T.S. Eliot called the ghost of meter. It's easy to take this too far to a point where the poem becomes chaotic. To practice loose iambics effectively, you have to know how to write iambically, which most poets today don't. Although English is naturally iambic, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Good writers will often exploit that natural rhythm reflexively. They're not conscious of that rhythm necessarily, but it's under the surface. In fact, there have been times where I'll read a free verse poem and I'll notice a line that is perfectly iambic. This is entirely unintentional on the poet's part. They weren't trying to write in iambics, but sometimes they still do it accidentally. This is why I've never really bought into the free verse trend. English is naturally iambic, like I said, and all poetry is about establishing patterns, so teaching aspiring poets they can just write whatever they want because anything goes, just write your feelings, people say, will not only make them bad writers, it's just plain false. All good poetry has some kind of rhythm, and this is the case with Walt Whitman. When you read Leaves of Grass, your first impression might be, these are the willy-nilly stream of consciousness ramblings of a madman who just wants to hug the universe. But no, that's only half true. Whitman did want to hug the universe, but he also wanted more than that. There is a subtle structure to those ramblings, but it takes a trained mind to detect it. The first thing we notice with our literary magnifying glass is that there is a biblical aspect to his syntax. He uses anaphora a lot in his poetry. Let's just look at Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. What we notice here is that where the anaphora of the book of Genesis started with God as its subject, Whitman starts with I. This says everything about the modern sensibility, but I won't go into that here. Whitman's anaphora is looser than in Genesis, but the principle remains. I now quote Rothman and Spear's analysis of this passage. In the third stanza above, my tongue fills the same function of every atom of my blood, and then both become objects formed from this soil, this air. And both are then born here of parents, who themselves similarly were born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. And only then, at the beginning of the third line, do we arrive at the subject, I, which we now realize has been modified by all this complex parallel modification that came before, and is now modified by what follows. Now 37 years old in perfect health, which only then is followed by the verb begin, before being modified yet again. Essentially, the sentence is, I begin, and everything else is a modifier of that simple statement. Very few, if any, free verse poets writing today are this skillful. We also notice something else here, that while Whitman is drawing on the natural rhythms of English in writing his poetry, there is kind of a formal-ish quality to it. Sometimes. The first line, I celebrate myself and sing myself, is perfect iambic pentameter. The second and third lines are mixtures of iambs and three-syllable feet. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Couldn't you just scan prose this way too if you were so inclined, if you looked hard enough? Well, yes. So was this line of perfect iambic pentameter accidental in Whitman's case, as in the case of many modern free verse poets where this occurs? I would say no. When you're thinking about great art, it's best to assume intention unless you have good reason otherwise. But more on that later. Now we come to the fourth pattern, non-alliterative stress counting. That's a bit of a mouthful. What does it mean? Well, this is influenced by Old English meter, where the specific number of syllables in each line doesn't matter, but there is a fixed number of strong stresses on syllables that alliterate, twice in the first half line and at least once in the second half line. Modern poets have used the stress counting while dropping the alliteration. Robinson Jeffers is considered to be the greatest master of this type of free verse. His inscription for a gravestone alternates between 5 and 2 strong stresses in each line, though the specific syllable count varies and it's unrhymed. 5. Skeltonic rhyme driving, or Skeltonics. This is when rhymes are employed in verse, but there's no rhyme scheme. It's not predictable. Meter is optional. There could be meter, or there could not. Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach is a famous example of this. But Arnold and others like him are, in this respect, distant descendants of John Skelton, the greatest English poet between Geoffrey Chaucer and the early Renaissance poets Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard. John Skelton's poetry was often mocked as doggerel in his time and for long after, and his critics are partly right, it is doggerel, but it's intentional doggerel. Skelton was writing satire. He uses short lines that have 2 or 3 stresses, but no regular meter. He employs rhyme in non-standard ways, maybe just a couplet or 12 rhyming lines in a row. I like Skelton because he is fun to read. Like Chaucer, his subject matter could be very bawdy, proving that not everyone in the Middle Ages was puritanical and prudish. Lots of 20th century poets have written Skeltonics. Robert Graves named a poem after him. And Allen Ginsberg also wrote in this style. As Rothman and Spear write, this demonstrates that there is little new under the sun. The greatest originality, including in free verse, lies in refashioning the past to new purposes. 6. Sprung rhythm. This was invented by Gerard Manley Hopkins, an extraordinary genius who was totally unknown in his lifetime. Hopkins was trying to create an English idiom for poetry. While most of his lines in Pied Beauty, one of his most famous pieces, can be scanned as iambic pentameter, it is much looser than Robert Frost's poem. Hopkins stretches this to the breaking point. His feet may have anywhere from 1 to 4 syllables. He often has headless lines that begin with stresses, and he'll eliminate weak syllables within the lines too so that they're just loaded with stresses. Take the line, all things counter, original, spare, strange. While there are 5 stresses in this line, only 2 are in the place you'd expect them to be in a normal pentameter line. Original on the third beat, and strange on the last. As the authors point out, this line really encapsulates Hopkins' style. His verse is counter, original, spare, strange. Or how about this line? With swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim. His use of pauses between every word makes this difficult to scan. Slow and sour are in unstressed positions, but are heavy words. In the case of slow, it should probably just take a secondary stress since it's in between swift and sweet. But this is less clear with sour. What follows it isn't a strong stress, but a weak one, the first syllable in a dazzle. It's also a question whether you would pronounce sour as 2 syllables or elide it into 1. If you want to scan this as a perfect, standard 10-syllable pentameter line, you'd have to go with sour as 2 syllables, which makes you want to give a strong stress to the sow part. Sour. So ultimately, I confess I'm not sure exactly how this line is supposed to be scanned. I'd probably go with 5 stresses. With swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim. But you might scan this as having 6 stresses, which you're totally justified in doing given all of these caesuras in the line. Or maybe don't emphasize either slow or sour and read it as having 4 beats. So that's sprung rhythm. It's kind of confusing, but not nearly as confusing as what comes next. Number 7, the variable foot. William Carlos Williams came up with this idea of the variable foot. Now, I myself have puzzled over this concept for quite a while because I've never really been quite sure what Williams is talking about here. And I was hoping the authors would explain this idea of variable feet to me, but they really don't. And that's because nobody really knows what a variable foot is, including William Carlos Williams. Basically, he just applied this idea to whatever he felt like so that anything and everything can be a variable foot. And this idea has had a harmful effect on students coming to poetry because it just doesn't really teach you anything about prosody. However, if we look not at Williams' theories of poetry, but his actual practice of writing poetry, we can see again how good free verse is all about setting up subtle expectations. Let's take his poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rain water, beside the white chickens. Again, I quote Rothman and Spear. There is a tremendous amount to say about this poem. As many have pointed out, despite its prosiness, it is obscure, unlike anything anyone would be likely to say in a conversation. And consider the kinds of patterns it presents. Each of the 4 stanzas has 3 words in the first line, 1 in the second. Each second line is 1 2-syllable word. 3 of those 4 second lines are trochees. As the linguist Hodge Ross has pointed out, the disposition of all the prepositional phrases does in fact make the sentence depend syntactically upon the red wheelbarrow. You can see this clearly if you diagram the sentence in a syntax tree. And there is much more. Williams was quite aware of the structures of language itself, even if his techniques were far less replicable than he may have believed. So those are 7 of the major free verse traditions, although you could possibly think of others. And every one that we've looked at here all have something in common. Now, this is a crucial fact about these poets, and that is all of the greatest free verse poets, from T.S. Eliot to Ezra Pound to Whitman, Wallace Stevens, W.H. Auden, Marianne Moore, etc., all of them wrote good formal verse. They're not necessarily known for writing formal verse, but they could do it. They were skilled at it. "O Captain, My Captain" is one of the greatest short poems written by an American. And because the education system back then still emphasized learning formal techniques in poetry, it made him a better free verse poet. A lot of his work is in fact written in loose iambics. Take "When I Heard the Learned Astronomer." When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, etc. Because his line lengths vary widely and he doesn't rhyme, the loose iambics in Whitman are disguised here. And since nobody learns scansion anymore, nobody notices this loose meter when they read the poem. And that's ultimately the problem with our time. Free verse poets today have really ceased to be innovative. Why is that? Well, one, it's the reigning orthodoxy in the academic establishment now. And when you become part of the orthodoxy, it's a sign you're not revolutionary anymore. Whatever political posturing you might be engaging in. All of these great free verse poets were able to be so innovative because they were drawing on the deep traditions of their cultural history to do something new. So if you liked this video and felt like you learned something from it, do consider picking up a copy of Learning the Secrets of English Verse. I've added an Amazon link in the description. There is so much in this book that explains how to write verse with a level of rigor that I have never encountered before. And I've read quite a few books about poetry. Rothman and Spear systematically discuss meter, different types of stresses and forms, beginning with the Anglo-Saxons and proceeding down to our own times. If you want to write poetry like the greats, this book will help you do that. So, with all the examples of free verse that we've looked at, and given the natural iambic rhythms of English, we can ask the question, is good free verse really just undercover formal verse? Of course it is. All good poetry is formal poetry.
Most everyone's mad here.
I should add that this view is not the position of the authors I've been discussing. This is my own opinion. And I would even go beyond that. If we examine the etymology of the word prose, we learn something surprising. Prose comes from the Latin prosa, a colloquial form of prorsa, the feminine declension of prorsis, meaning straightforward or straight ahead. This is, of course, what poetry does. It moves forward from line to line. And the word prose was meant to contrast with poetry, a more artful style of communicating. It was a term related to oratory, where the speaker delivers a straightforward speech, as opposed to something more high-flown and rhetorical. According to the historical thesaurus of the Oxford English Dictionary, the earliest recorded usage of the word prose in English occurred in 1330. Though the word is ultimately derived from Latin, it came into English by way of French. But if we look at verse, that word has an older history. Related to poetry as a noun, that first recorded usage is 1300, while verse as an intransitive verb meaning to compose poetry dates back to Old English. Thursian. Of course, today we don't Thursian, we versify, but the derivation remains. Verse came before prose, both in the words we use to describe it and in the actual practice of poetry. Virtually all the ancient works of literature are written in verse, not prose. The odd novel by Apuleius or Petronius is an exception, as are the dialogues of Plato. So, what can we conclude here? Other than the fact that poetry came first and is obviously just better than that formless, artless style of writing we designate with the euphemism free verse, otherwise known as prose. It's a notable fact that for Vladimir Nabokov, there was no meaningful distinction between poetry and prose. Of course, Nabokov was a great prose writer. His prose is highly poetical. But when we go beyond Nabokov's works and look at your average ya novel today, we can see that we are dealing with the verbal equivalent of toilet paper. and the pages of these books suit that purpose well. Nevertheless, all prose has its roots in poetry. Everything is poetry. It's in your emails to your boss. It's on your phones when you're sexting your boy toy. Okay, not really.
You may have noticed that I'm not all there.
Now, the term formalist verse may not be a misnomer like free verse is, but it is a bit redundant. All verse is formal, though it may lack the ism associated with a particular school of formal verse. The proper distinction is not between free verse and formal verse, but between verse that is metrical and verse that isn't. But in the same way that nobody can do calculus if they don't know basic arithmetic, it's difficult to pull off your radical free verse experiments if you're ignorant of the basic building blocks of poetry. You can't reinvent the wheel if you don't know how spokes work.